Welcome, everyone. My name is David Lee from PreventConnect, and welcome to today's PreventConnect web conference, Connecting the Dots, Understanding and Addressing the Links Between Multiple Forms of Violence. I'm very excited to be able to see so many of you joining us today. Many of you I see are people who I know through prevention work throughout the country, and many others who we are learning about today. So great to be able to, and new to us, and so welcome for today's session. This is a very important topic that's deep in my heart. I really think this is an important part of our prevention work. This is PreventConnect. PreventConnect has a wide variety of ways that you can connect with us as an organization. You have all visited our website to sign up. You can always email us. We do have an email group for those of you who are interested. We have e-learning units. We have a wiki, which is just like Wikipedia, but only on prevention topics. And then we also are on many forms of social media. So we hope that you will join us and converse with us in many ways. I want to be able to talk about how to use this technology. You'll be seeing many things here. One of them is how to raise your hand. You'll see above my head on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little button hand that says My Status. Go ahead and raise your hand, please. Let's see how many of you can raise your hand. Thank you. This is just one of the ways we might be asking questions of you during the session today, and it's a way that we can be able to get information from you and learn about some of what you're doing. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and lower everyone's hands now, if I can. There. We do have a text chat. Many of you have already figured out how to do that. You would type in the box there, click on this. If you want to send a private chat to someone, another participant, click on the private tab and you can click on the name of someone, and it's a way that you can be able to join us. And so I want to be able to do that. We also, so we have that private chat. Many of you have figured out how to do this. This is how we know what the weather is for those of you throughout the country who is joining us. Go ahead and write down your name, your city, the state you are, and what the weather is where you are. So I imagine that Kelly and Helena, Montana might be somewhat cold there. I am guessing, but I could be wrong. So thank you very much. We do have PowerPoint slides today that's going to be available. And I believe I did not put them on yet. So Ashley, I believe I have to put them on. So I'm going to get the slides up very soon, and I will post the link once when they are on. They are not available quite yet, but they will be shortly. You are on the phone, and we have everyone's phone lines are there. We have closed captioning. If you are not seeing the captioning, please go look in the upper right-hand corner and click on the CC box. And that as a web conference for guidelines, we want to let you know that we want you to be good etiquette behavior. We are here. We want to have a conversation with each other, share ideas, but this is not a place to be selling your products. And if there's a topic that is off conversation, go ahead, have private conversations with other people, but I might be asking you to keep to the conversation. You can always, if you're having trouble getting on the web conference, call iLink Technical Support at 800-799-4510. PreventConnect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. I do want to get a little bit of who is in this session so we can learn about that. So I'm going to be asking you a few questions. The first question that I want to ask, and it should appear on your screen, is have you attended a web conference before today? So let us know if this is your first web conference you have ever attended. If you've attended a web conference before, but this is the first time you're attending a PreventConnect web conference. Have you gone to one or two previous PreventConnect web conferences, or are you one of our regulars and have gone to at least 3 or more? And I can see that only about half of you have voted, so go ahead and vote on the screen. Just click on the screen, and you'll be able to see that. And I'm going to share the results, and what we'll see is that 3% of you, it's the first time you've been on a web conference. 10% of you have been on other web conferences, not with us. 21% have been on 1 to 2 previous web conferences, and almost 40% of you have been on 3 or more PreventConnect web conferences. So we have many people who are familiar with us. I also want to be able to thank you for joining us. What makes PreventConnect exciting is that it is a conversation among colleagues on how to be able to create change. I want to be able to ask the next question, what best describes your organization? You can only select one, do the best one to describe it. Are you with a sexual violence agency or coalition, or domestic violence agency or coalition, or dual domestic violence and sexual assault agency or coalition? Do you work with a college or university, or a state, territorial, or federal public health department? Are you with other types of state, territorial, or federal government, or a tribal organization, or education, or child abuse, maltreatment? And we have a long list. So go ahead and write them down. I'm going to share the results so you can see that the most common response are dual sexual assault domestic violence agencies or coalitions, followed by people from state, territorial, or federal public health departments. We also have people from colleges and universities, people from domestic violence agencies or sexual assault agencies or coalitions, and some from child maltreatment, and some from community-based organizations, and some from criminal justice, and a few others. So thank you all for sharing that. I am going to go ahead and close the poll for everyone's tab. We PreventConnect focuses primarily on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual violence, but we are looking at violence across the lifespan. So we're looking at from the abuse of children to those who are elders. We want to focus on the primary prevention or preventing before violence starts, and we are all about connections. So connecting the dots is the appropriate conversation because we want to connect to other forms of violence, as today's topic is, and other forms of oppression. And we also want to be able to make connections to other prevention practitioners so we can learn from each other to be able to strengthen the work that we are doing. So with it, today's topic is called Connecting the Dots, an overview of the links among multiple forms of violence. And today's objectives are to have you be able to describe what the latest research says about shared risk and protective factors across different forms of violence, describe how experiencing one form of violence can affect people's risks for experiencing other forms of violence, be able to describe how to consider people's risk and protective factors for multiple forms of violence within the context of their community. And then I think perhaps most importantly, give examples the way that state health departments and other types of organizations can address multiple forms of violence through shared risk and protective factors. And just to note, as I had said earlier, that the findings and conclusions do not represent the official position of the Centers for Disease Control. So disclaimers are well-founded. So I want to introduce the speakers we have today, and we've got many, and I'm really pleased to have people who some of whom I've had a chance to work with quite a bit, and some who I am just getting to know now. So we are joined by Annie Lyles from Prevention Institute, who works with us, who I've worked very closely with in PreventConnect for many years. Hi, Annie. How are you doing today?
Hey, wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, David. I think you and I are about to celebrate 8 years together.
Right. We're actually celebrating 10 years of PreventConnect, but that will be coming in the next couple months. We also have We also have Tomei Kuehl, who's from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Hi, Tomei.
Hi, David.
Great. So glad to have you joining us. And from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we have a wonderful team of Marcy Hertz. Hi, Marcy.
Hi, David. Good afternoon.
Great to have you. And also Natalie Wilkins.
Hi,
Natalie. Great. And I had a chance actually just to be having a conversation at the CDC a few weeks ago with Marcy and Natalie, so it's great to be able to see you now virtually. I also want to be able to, we have a special guest just to start us off, and Annie, why don't you introduce our person just who's going to get us going.
Yes, absolutely. I'm here. So thank you so much, David, for the intro. One of the things, we've done a few of these web conferences over the last month. Perhaps you've seen them in your inbox. We're so glad you joined us for the PreventConnect one. And we've asked Taylor Code Maxie Jr., who is a hip-hop artist born and bred in South Central Los Angeles and Linwood, California, to start us off. And for me, the real importance of this piece is that like many of his peers, Taylor fell victim to the gang epidemic in the 1990s, and at 16 found himself detained in detention, and that's when he first connected with a group called Street Poets. They're active in LA, and he was a participant in their writing workshops. He later became a founding member of the organization's youth poetry performance group. But however, his addictions and gang ties caught up with him, and he landed in prison for nearly 7 years. During his incarceration, Taylor recommitted himself to his own education, his healing, and his recovery. Taylor is now a father of 4 and a youth outreach coordinator for Street Poets. He facilitates workshops and has performed his work recently at the Gang Intervention and Prevention Conference, which was where I heard him. He stopped me in my tracks and really made me revisit the way I think about and do my work. So I'm very honored to have him here. He's going to share his story of how he came to understand the links between multiple forms of violence. So I ask all of you in the audience today, as much as we want you at your keyboard, fingers busy, typing, to sit back in your chair, take a deep breath, and if you're multitasking, which I'm sure none of you do during web conferences, stop what you're doing and be prepared to enjoy a moment with an incredible artist, Taylor Code Maxie Jr. With that, Taylor, I'll turn it over to you for your spoken word piece.
Thank you, thank you. I got so much rage in the bank, I'm living large off the interest. An investment trust account, reaping the perks of big business. But before I self-destruct and let the wealth tear me apart, let me splurge for a minute and get this burden off my heart. I don't know how to start because it's dark and runs deep. Back to that demon I first saw when my parents were both asleep. I swear it only seems like it was just yesterday when Pops threw Mama in the tub with blood gushing from her face. That was a quarter century ago, but I'm still hearing screams. In my cell yelling no because they echo in my dream. Mama took me off to Texas when the dope took you under, and it was there I got molested, and my sunshine turned to thunder. Reflecting on these troubles, sometimes my tears become laughs, because you had the nerve to wonder why I chose to walk a dark path. My last hope was the streets, so I banged the local gang, but that even took something I can never again claim. Can the Lord blame me for all the sins I've committed? Or close the pearly gates because I lack the wisdom to do different? I wanted the world to feel the kind of pain I was feeling, so I robbed and pistol whipped the man, one of his own children. And to make matters worse, homie showed me love for that, celebrating all the hate that I now wish I could take back. Was it the Haldol and Cogentin that ran through Mama's veins, mixed with the dope and daddy seed that made me grow to be insane? When I felt the urge to change, my enemies cast me out with slugs and left me leaking in the street, talking to God about peace. My scars tell a story that only pauses for effect as I choke off the gun smoke, praying to take another breath. I'd be lying if I said I never cried in my cell, because I'm forced to face the truth walking the main line in jail. It's hell to be alone and prevail against these thoughts, but I'm thankful for the chance because I was way too lost. I didn't know how good it felt to smile till I was on the verge of death with 30 staples in my stomach and half a dozen in my neck. It's obvious that I'm blessed because I can still draw some breath, but it's also clear that I'm cursed to bear the burden of such stress. If I had to formulate the words to explain the world to my daughter, it'd probably take some Hail Marys and a fifth of holy water. Am I wrong for wanting to tell her these ugly facts we tend to hide? Or should I keep my mouth shut and hope she finds a way to rise? I treasure times like this when the truth invades my spirit, but the sad thing is not too many want to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. This is always a moment that's hard. Usually you have an audience full of people smiling, maybe some tearing up, and what we have is text chat. So for those of you that are there, feel free to chime in. We always share the text chat with Taylor. But Taylor, before you go, I was hoping you could share a minute with us. What kind of brought you to this kind of poetry linking multiple forms of violence in your life?
Well, I actually, when I wasn't, it took me a lifetime to be able to look at myself, as authentically as that poem did. But the situation that I was in, I was, in prison, facing a lot of time, and I was just trying to, find a way to forgive myself for, making such a mess out of my life, and so when I, so that's what, so that forced me to dig deep into my own story, because I didn't want to carry the whole burden of of what my life had turned out to be, you know. So I dug deep into myself, and, you know, when I wrote that piece, it was like, you know, the weight of the world had, you know, was lifted off my shoulders. You know, I was able to actually start to remember, you know, more positive things about my life in spite of all of that, you know, of all of that negativity that, you know, that was contained inside that piece. It was actually like I unpacked a lot of psychological and emotional trauma, you know, just through that poem. But and I realized that you know, the piece helped me realize that every time that, you know, me joining a gang, me, you know, every time I lit up a blunt or took a drink or popped a, you know, an ecstasy pill, I realized that those were things that I was using to actually escape, you know, the trauma from my childhood. And, you know, and I wish that I had actually wrote that poem, or, you know, I wish I had wrote that poem a lot earlier on in life, because it probably would have prevented me from making a whole bunch of dumb decisions. You know, so.
Yeah, the people on the audience today primarily are in sexual and domestic violence agencies, and I wonder what advice would you give them as they think about how multiple forms of violence apply to their work? And there's a couple questions in the text chat, so after you kind of answer that question, we'll ask a couple from the text chat.
Okay, absolutely. Repeat the question one more time.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Poor interviewing technique. My question was, a lot of the folks in the audience are in domestic violence agencies or sexual assault agencies. What advice would you have for them for, you know, better integrating multiple forms of violence, kind of honoring the place of kids like you?
Well, you definitely have to, because sometimes the domestic violence or those are some of the earliest times in, you know, in a young person's life that the seeds of violence are planted when they seeing, you know, things, you know, go on between their parents, you know, or whoever the adults may be in their household, and sometimes, you know, sometimes there's a desire to want to, you know, immediately fix what's going on, you know, in a person's situation, but you know, so sometimes it's effective to just, you know, let a person, you know, kind of air out, you know, and decompress what it is that they're going through and where they're, you know, what they've seen or what they're experiencing, and then kind of, you know, let them kind of take the lead on what they actually want to do, you know, how they want to go about, you know, resolving the situation themselves, and, like, you know, how can we help? Like, 'cause, you know, I work with a lot of traumatized kids too, and, you know, and the hardest thing to do, you know, especially like when you've been in a lot of the situations that they've been in, the hardest thing to do is just stand by and watch what's going on and be, well, you know what, if you need to talk, I'm here, you know, or whatever or whatnot. But it's one of the most effective, because by, you know, extending the invitation like that, you know, that prevents us from coming off as if we're trying to force some type of solution or something down, you know, somebody's throat, you know.
Yeah.
Cause,
you know, go ahead.
Well, I was saying, like, you know, people coming up in these situations, you know, they've come up in these situations, you know, for so long that they've been conditioned to feel like that this is what's normal for them. So at times, you know, when we, you know, as workers, you know, come in and, you know, and try to, like, fix things, what we're doing, we actually are posing a threat to what's, you know, what is normal to them, and that at times that can trigger, you know, pushback, you know, from those people in those situations. So, you know, it definitely has to be like, you know, well, it doesn't happen, but, you know, it's we as street poets, we've learned that it's a really effective approach is the invitational one, you know, to kind of let you know, the people involved in the situation kind of dictate the pace at which the resolution is going to come.
Well, and I think that's really the theme today, is thinking about how we broaden our invitation, or how do we strategically partner so that our invitation can honor where folks at, especially those experiencing multiple forms of violence, and what are the good solutions, things like street poets that actually prevent multiple forms of violence. So thank you so much, Taylor. You got thunderclaps in the text chat, and Trina appreciates the shout out to South Central. Folks are asking if they could have copies of the poem, and what I'll do is, maybe, Taylor, we put your contact information in the text chat. Maybe they could email you if they'd like a copy of the poem. Would that be okay?
Yes, ma'am. That's totally fine. No problem at all.
And it looks like that Prevention Institute also posted a link to it, so we have that also available. So
awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Taylor, for joining us, and really for setting the tone for today's conversation. And so let's ask an audience just now, based on what we heard in Taylor's poem and based on what you know, let's hear a little bit. This is an audience that knows a lot about this topic, and so we'll be sharing the details and think about this tool, but we also want to be able to draw from the knowledge that all of you have. I'm actually going to, right now I'm posting the links to the slides that are available, but let's go ahead and ask, what linkages do you see? And put this in the text chat. I'd like to hear, Annie, I think that Taylor really illustrated so many of these linkages, but I'd like to hear from the audience. What links do you see between different forms of violence, and what are the pieces that, from the work that you do, that you see as those linkages that move forward? So go ahead and let's write in the text chat about what linkages do you see between different forms of violence. And I know that many of you here are from domestic violence or sexual assault agencies, and many of them are addressing both. And we also have some people addressing child maltreatment. So I'd love to be able to hear people doing this. And so we can see the history of family violence and how that ties. And a response, violence is a form of a response. And Clara talks about human trafficking and sex trafficking that then draw these. And Brenda talks about the generation, and I think the generational, and Malcolm talks about the same thing. And oppression. Leona, great to hear from you, Leona. And alcohol and drug use. And Benny talks about reproductive coercion and STIs and teen dating violence. Re-victimization, being caught in that cycle. And poly-victimization, sort of a word for being victimized in many different ways, and suicide and self-harm, along with adverse childhood experiences. So there's early trauma and the ACEs that we'll be talking about later on today, and so a lot of adverse childhood experiences for ACEs. And then power and control, Regina talks about as a theme that I think goes through many of these, and there's a lot of childhood exposure issues. So Annie, I'm seeing a lot about from children, and here's Lauren talks about the connection between animal abuse and violence, and that there's all these different ways that people get hurt. So our audience sees many of these connections.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some of the big buzzwords that we're going to kind of explore further today, things like trauma and ACEs, the fine line between victims and perpetrators. All of these things we're going to go deeper in. And what I love about PreventConnect is this isn't so much about experts offering a training. This is about having a discussion about what does this really look like. One of the first things we found as we started exploring this document is that it's been in the literature, this topic of connecting the dots between forms of violence for like 30 years. And for a lot of you in the field, you've probably heard this conversation before. So the real question we're going to be exploring today, and the reason we wanted to do this brief and partner with DEC, was that the academics hasn't translated to practice. And why hasn't that translated? What are the opportunities to translate it are some of the big questions and the deep questions we have today, and what are some of those leverages, which are some of the things that came out today. So let's get moving, David, yeah?
Let's go on. So
all right. So
take it.
This is one of the kind of quotes we started from, and I saw Trina mentioned hurt people, and one of the first things we kind of thought about as one of our Unity co-chairs at Prevention Institute. She's also an adjunct professor at Harvard School of Public Health, Deborah Prothrow-Stith. She said, gang violence is connected to bullying, is connected to school violence, is connected to intimate partner violence, is connected to child abuse, is connected to elder abuse. It's all connected. And I think for a lot of us, that's easy to say, and yet it's not so much how we do our work. And so that's the question that we'll be exploring today with an amazing new tool that CDC co-authored with Prevention Institute. And Marcy, I will let you introduce our brand new tool that does a lot of homework on this issue for us.
Thank you. Dum-da-da-dum. Thank you so much, Andy.
I should have done a better drum roll. Sorry.
I'm sorry. That was my best go at it. So, yes, thank you so much. This is Connecting the Dots. I'm hoping that many of you have downloaded this already, or if not, that you certainly do so after this webinar is over. But this represents really our response to what we were hearing from the field, that people in the field know that these forms of violence intersect, and we'll have a slide that shows that in a moment. So this was CDC's response to what we were hearing from the field is we really could use some assistance in synthesizing the research about these overlaps. So that's what the purpose of this document is, to synthesize the connections between the different forms of violence, the things that increase or decrease a person, a family, or an entire community's risk, as well as the things that protect and buffer people from these risks. The audience for this are public health practitioners and those who are familiar with public health terminology, although we tried our CDC best to be as jargon-free as we can. So the purpose was to help people better understand and make the case for connections between multiple forms of violence, and to think strategically and creatively about how to prevent all types of violence from occurring in the first place. And as Annie said, we really want this to be a conversation. This is not CDC saying this is what the field should do. We want this to be a conversation about what you all are already doing related to these connections, and what great ideas do you have about different ways we could advance this work even further.
So now, Marcy, let's actually ask our audience, have you actually read the report yet? I'd like to know how many people have. And I know some people reading it will count as skimming and getting it here. So let's see what, go ahead and vote. On the lower left-hand corner, there's a little box, a chance to vote. And, oh, the yeses are starting to make a comeback. So we can see that I think a lot of people, I'll share their findings here, that about a quarter of our audience have read it, and about 3/4 will read it soon. I'll interpret it that way. So how's that for reframing the work? So Marcy, we've got we're the beginning to expose, and we had we had to repeat this session because this sold out so quickly, and the session on December 2nd is already sold out, and I know you've been sharing it elsewhere, so there's a lot of interest.
Yeah, so we hope this will spark your interest and you will all rush to the website to download the document.
And we put a link to the document there in the text chat, so you can link to it anytime under Prevention Institute right there, and we'll put lots of links up as the time goes forward. One of the things that comes up a lot is the phrase hurt people, and I saw maybe Trina, I don't know if I'm quoting you correctly, put that up today. And that's really the start of this, is that folks are really interested in how these things link together. But we know that it goes much deeper than that. And so what I'm going to ask you today is to sit in the complexity of this issue. And when we think about the multiple forms of violence at Prevention Institute, we understand that exposure to one form of violence increases the risk for further victimization, engagement, and violent behavior. Like, that's absolutely there. But as practitioners, one of the most important things that's come out of this work is how these forms of violence are connected. They are experienced together, they share common underlying factors, and they result in common outcomes. And those three things, more than anything, are really what practitioners can take away and start integrating into your work to improve practice. So we'll be looking at those three things today, in addition to kind of understanding how exposure to one form increases the other. But we want to make sure you understand that it doesn't stop there. We are going to sit in the complexities of this issue and try to really honor where folks are. The first part we want to talk about is how these multiple forms are sometimes experienced together. And the fancy term polyvictimization already came up today. But CDC put together this nice graph, and I'll let Marcy explain it for you when we think about the lifespan.
Great, thanks, Annie. And I saw this come up a lot in the comments after Taylor was talking. Certainly the poem that he read was a powerful depiction of this graphic. The point of this graphic is really just to show how different types of violence occur across the entire lifespan. And frequently different forms of violence impact the same individuals or the same communities, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different points of time. And also something we saw depicted in Taylor's poem and in many of your comments was that sometimes experiencing one form of violence increases the risk of experiencing or perpetrating another form of violence at a different point in the lifespan.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes up is, although this is a long list, this isn't exhaustive, and Benny's on, so we have to think about reproductive coercion is probably being on this list somewhere, and I saw Cordelia's on, so we can think about sex trafficking and all the other types of violence. But one of the things that's important to think of is think about some of those pieces as a continuum. I saw Carol's asking about a link to this graph, so just so you all know, the slides are already available. And this graph is in the document, so we put a link to the document available. And I believe, Marcy, you actually have slides to share with folks, and that you'll put a link to those in at the end too. So just as you guys get excited about the material, it's meant to be used, and so please do use it. We're going to put lots of links.
Yes, and I'm sorry, you can use individual slides in addition to the entire presentation if there are particular slides that are compelling or you'd like to use.
Yeah. So in the next slide, we just have a statistic for you kind of to think about when we think about folks like Taylor. And I don't seem to have the power to advance the slides at the moment. Thank you very much. But we looked at the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, and one of the things to think about is 1 in 10 children in the U.S. are either witnesses or victims by co-occurring forms of violence, and how little we take that into account in our work. I always like to point out that it's, out of 100 kids, it's not just, oh gosh, I can't do that math in my head very quickly, 10. I'm such a social worker. What I like to remember is it's not just a random group of kids. We know that there are clusters of kids where these rates are much higher. When we think about kids growing up in reservations, growing up in communities that have been impacted for generations, but this isn't an equitable distribution across our country. This is a health equity issue. And so as much as it's 1 in 10, we know in a lot of communities it's much higher. And so we're doing a disservice when we don't acknowledge some of these links between multiple forms of violence. This is from the National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence. We're trying to give you some good resources as you try to make the case with folks. This is the Attorney General's report. And they said, these multiple victims are at the highest risk of suffering chronic and severe symptoms of traumatic stress in terms of, the long-term psychiatric problems, limitations on health, well-being. And I feel like this is such an important point, that these risks are especially high when exposure to violence involves a fundamental loss of trust and security. We all know those child development pieces and how important it is for caregivers and for attachment. And that's really what violence does. It undermines that ability to have attachment when you lose a fundamental loss of trust and security. So we think that that's really one of the most important things to think about when we think about those multiple forms of violence is that we need to acknowledge the folks that are experiencing multiple pieces. The good news is that they also share, and this doesn't sound like good, underlying factors. But the underlying factors are not just risk factors, but they're also protective factors. So this is where CDC's expertise and their stamp of credibility is fantastic. They've done some really amazing research brainstorming with us on risk and protective factors that are common. So I'll turn it over to Marcy there.
Great. Thanks so much, Annie. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. The document is online. I want to make sure we have time for our superstar, Tomei, at the end. But essentially, research on this is continually evolving. So this just represents the state of the field at the time that we did the review, so up through last year. And because the review is so exhaustive across different types of violence and people referred or used different terminology across the different papers, we did our best to collapse them into general categories, but there were differences in paper to paper in the specifics of these categories. We tried to use very liberal criteria about whether we put an X in that box, and you'll see what I mean or not, but X demonstrates a relationship between a specific type of violence and a risk factor or protective factor. So any article that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, we permitted ourselves to put an X in that box. But I do want to indicate that an absence of an X does not mean that there was not a relationship. In many cases, it's simply that that relationship either has not been tested or was not tested and published in the peer-reviewed literature. I think we're going to, oh, I can advance the slide. There we go. So these are the X's I was referring to. So these are societal level risk factors. Across the top, the CM is child maltreatment. The TDV is teen dating violence. IPV, intimate partner violence. SV, sexual violence. And YV, youth violence. So you see here there's quite a few X's that cut across all of these different forms of violence. For sexual violence, we see an X in weak health, educational, economic, and social policies and laws. So for things like this related to SV, they're weak laws related to gender equity. They're weak policies or laws related to community sanctions against sexual violence perpetrators. For things related to harmful gender norms and sexual violence, these are things related to traditional views about what is masculine and what is feminine in terms of female submissiveness, and things along those lines are what popped up related to sexual violence and these particular risk factors. Okay. I think I will turn it over to Annie now.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is not only provide the, the risk and resilience factors, we wanted it to come alive. And we'll move pretty quickly through these examples. If you want to go in depth on any of them, please just send me an email. Let's have a conversation. I can link you to folks. In Todd County, South Dakota, the Charging Buffalo group, who have been on PreventConnect before, are a really great example of this. Well, they're looking at culture. They're not starting with a form of violence. One of the feedbacks we've gotten from a lot of these groups that are experience multiple forms of violence is that it's exhausting to keep talking about violence, and they wanted something really positive to bring to their community. And culture and cultural matters is one of the things that happens. So they've gone back to cultural teachings that promote healthy lifestyles, restoring traditions that value, respect women, and that really gets to countering some of those harmful gender roles. Another example we like to share is out of the health department in Boston, the Public Health Commission there. If you haven't seen the halls, go check it out. It's fantastic. The webisodes are incredible. And they really start bringing up some of these norms supporting aggression, also media violence. And they really counter some of these things in a perspective that young people have written, have directed. And as you can see in the descriptions, they're really sifting through relationships, trauma, masculinity, their own identities. And one of the things when they were guests on PreventConnect, they said, having a webisodes and being able to ask these questions, we can explore the complexities, we can explore the intersections between these things in a way we can't always do with a poster, with a curriculum. And I really, really enjoyed it, and it's meant as a tool for other people. So it's a great place to kind of start when you're thinking about some of these multiple forms of violence.
Great, thanks, Annie. And those are fantastic examples. Maybe can someone from Prevention Institute, maybe Annie, put up the link to the Halls of Boston? I know we have that somewhere. Oops, we went too far.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh. If you could put up that link to the webisodes, that would be great. Give us a second.
Great. So these are neighborhood level risk factors, and I do want to note that we are not putting up a slide for societal level protective factors, and unfortunately that's because we couldn't find any in the literature. So we're hoping that is a gap that will soon be filled. So these are neighborhood or community level risk factors. For sexual violence, you'll see neighborhood poverty and things associated with neighborhood poverty, for example, overcrowding, exposure to community violence, and lack of economic opportunities are all neighborhood risk factors that are associated with sexual violence, as well as many other forms of violence, as you can see here. Okay, now we'll go back to the alcohol policy examples, David.
Okay.
That way. There we go. Okay, Annie.
Annie, can you talk about the alcohol policy? And it's actually
yes,
there's
I was on mute. Sorry,
interesting papers coming out very soon on this.
Oh, good. So one of the things I was going to say is, low neighborhood support, social cohesion, real quickly. It's when we do strategic planning in communities, it's one of the things that comes up quickly. as one of the #1 issues folks are interested in. And now CDC has the data for folks to understand and make that linkage and how it prevents violence. I think a lot of times policymakers feel like that's kind of a fuzzy answer. But you have good data now that you can take forward to show how that directly connects to preventing violence. Another one that folks are kind of hesitant to touch, and I'm guilty of this as well, is thinking about alcohol policy and reductions in alcohol. And I looked at this data from the Virginia Academic Center for Youth Violence Prevention at the Commonwealth University in Virginia, and it just really humbled me. Basically what they found is that they wanted to, they looked at ambulance rates and ambulance pickups. And so they wanted to decrease the number of violent crime and injuries connected to single-serving alcoholic beverages. And so they got a ban passed at these local liquor stores, and the results were really startling. When the new policy was in effect, the average rate of violence-related ambulance pickups for youth 15 to 24 declined from 13 per 1,000 to 0. And so when I think about that, I'm like, wow, that's an incredibly effective strategy. Unfortunately, there was a push from the convenience stores about the policy, and they got it overturned at their local level. And as soon as the policy was overturned, the rate increased to 5.3 pickups per 1,000. So there's some pretty compelling data there about alcohol and violence. And you think about kind of the impact of not only for the individual, the cost for the ambulance pickup, but also what it's like for community to have that kind of violence happen in front of others. So really important strategy to consider as we do this work.
And Annie, I just want to add that there's going to be several papers that are going to be coming out looking at alcohol policy and the prevention of perpetration of sexual violence and domestic violence. Those will be coming out soon, and PreventConnect will be hosting a web conference to discuss those issues about alcohol policy as related to sexual and domestic violence prevention. So that will be coming in 2015.
I'm so glad. It's one of those topics that I think we hesitate to talk about for a lot of reasons. But I'm just convinced, and Casey put up a link to the paper that I read on it, that we're doing a disservice by not exploring this a little bit more.
Yeah,
glad to hear this more.
Yeah, that's really exciting news, David. And I also want to mention that when we talk about integrating linkages, sometimes there are things we can do that are very simple. Like in the outcomes you mentioned, Annie, there weren't any sexual violence outcomes mentioned. That doesn't mean that there weren't any. It just means that in that particular study, they didn't measure them. So in a lot of cases, it could be just a case of expanding the types of variables that folks look at when they're looking at the impact of a particular intervention or prevention strategy. Okay, so why do I feel like I have the boring slide? Neighborhood protective factor. So, one of the things that immediately jumps out at me when I look at this slide is the absence of X's. So you can see, unfortunately, there are a lot more X's. There's a lot more research on risk factor rather than protective factor. I think the tide is starting to change on that, but there's still far more that we know increases risk than buffers. But there are things that we know, particularly at the neighborhood level for sexual violence prevention. Community support and connectedness is an important factor, and that's measured a variety of different ways. Unfortunately, sometimes it's asking individuals and then aggregating up, but feeling like they know people in their neighborhood, that others would intervene, that others would help them. Social capital types of things are protective for sexual violence, as well as intimate partner violence, child maltreatment, suicide, and elder abuse.
Yeah, and I mean, again, community support and connectedness also is an incredibly popular strategy for folks. People love doing that at the local level, and I think we don't do enough of it. We don't link it to our curriculums. We don't link it to our social message campaigns, but it's something that everyone has the capacity to help do and to help partner. We wanted to give you a couple examples of the trickier two. Well, I guess that's not really true, but to the other two that maybe aren't as popular sometimes, but access to mental health and substance abuse services. This is in Minneapolis, where they're really working to make school-based mental health very accessible. We talked about the community schools movement and thinking about how we really make everyone have access to mental health support and services, especially those that have experienced trauma. Also, another PreventConnect guest in the past, this is the Ohio Wellness and Prevention Network. When we think about coordination of services among community agencies, they started as a first step mapping out the different injury and violence persons in their network at the state level so they could start figuring out how they could do some work in dyads and triads, just as a first step for thinking about this. And Tommy's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in Colorado coming up. But just so you know, people are doing it. So with that, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so I'd love to just get a sense of, once again, as our audience, we're sharing this and we're going to go through some more soon, but we want to hear from the audience. What activities are you doing to address the linkages between different types of violence? And so I'd love to get some examples of the work that you're doing throughout the state, throughout your community, whether it's your local community, your state, or if you're doing national work, or if you're in another country or province, the work you're doing, or territories. So I'd love to hear from you. What type of activities are you doing to address the linkages between different types of violence? And I think that
David,
there's
a
wealth of... Please.
One of the things that's interesting is that a lot of folks are doing this, but not necessarily taking credit for it. So they're doing really good, like, social emotional learning curriculum. I saw Barry's on from Safe Place in Austin, but they're not necessarily saying or taking credit or doing the measurement, as Marcy said, about how it connects to other forms of violence. And I think it's a tool for sustainability for folks. As folks are typing in what they're doing, you may be doing something as these are protective factors, and you may be able to bring down other funding. You may be able to bring down other partners, have a more extended reach because of the understanding that this risk and protective factor you're working on, in your agency is also preventing other forms of violence.
Right. So I think that's, so true. It's interesting. In my career, I've worked in many different, in child maltreatment, I've worked in domestic violence, I've worked in sexual assault. From a prevention angle, I think the work we've done has been the same. It's and that we need to be able to find ways to be able to move forward. So I see here, understand and incorporate into what we're doing our trainings. We need to start describing that work there. Interdisciplinary committees and finding ways of moving forward. School-based group. Barry was talking about some of the school-based programs that she's doing in Texas. Ashley talks about animal rights, looking at how that also is connected to preventing domestic violence, and gardening, law enforcement and teens, helping people see each other. Virginia talks about that's a really interesting list. Yeah. And Trina talks about connecting with other social justice movements like racial equity, immigration rights, because these social justice movements are integrated in getting these expressions together and being able to do some of that work. And Leslie says even with clients we can talk about addressing childhood violence, sexual assault, being trauma, how it affects people. So I think a lot of us do this, and now it's about how do we connect the dots in our own mind, and then where do we go to the next level to start connecting the dots to where we can move forward. So I want to now move on back to you, Marcy, and talk about relationship level risk factors.
Thanks, David. Unfortunately, what you can see here is that there are a plethora of X's on relationship level risk factors, particularly related to SV here, poor parent-child relationships, and that's been examined with both relationship between child and mother through observational studies, as well as quality of relationships with father and father responsiveness. Family conflict, witnessing domestic violence in the home, association with delinquent peers, and we'll see in a minute a flip side, but essentially associating with peers who think that sexual violence is acceptable increases risk for a sexual violence perpetration, and I think that is an important point to emphasize throughout these. These are risks for perpetration of all these types of violence. And then gang violence involvement is also an additional relationship level risk factor for sexual violence perpetration.
And I think here for these, probably none of these are surprising for you. Hopefully this is a tool that you can take to your policymakers, to your coalitions, and help, stand up and say, look, these things are connected. We can work together, or these things are connected. We can, be more thoughtful in our approaches. One of the tools that I like to highlight is actually a CDC tool, the Essentials for Parenting Toddlers and Preschoolers, because it specifically goes to that kind of family conflict, parent-child relationship. It's meant for everyone. For everyone, when we think about good prevention, what does it take for everyone to grow and thrive? This is a wonderful tool, and it's something that can go across multiple forms of violence. The other one is the health department in Ramsey County, Minnesota. That's St. Paul. If you don't know about their work, go look it up, and I think we have a link to one of their peer-reviewed journals. But they're looking at this kind of harsh parenting and parent conflict in 3 different settings: domestic violence shelters, public libraries, and the Children's Museum, and they're changing organizational practices to better handle family conflict and actually prevent it, to prevent harsh parenting practices. And it's really innovative what they're doing. And what I like is they're going to organizational practice change as a really positive way to affect the whole population.
Okay, thanks. So now we're here at protective factors, and again, there's unfortunately less protective factors, and only one that we can find in the peer-reviewed literature at the relationship level that was protected for sexual violence prevention, which was connection, feeling connected or connected to the school, that folks that they belong to the school, feeling like they fit in at the school, was an important protective factor at the relationship or individual level for sexual violence perpetration prevention. That was a mouthful.
So Annie, maybe you can talk about the Rethink over in New Orleans.
Thanks, David. So in New Orleans, we have a lot of folks that are a little bit worried about kind of policy and practice. And so I always give them the example of the Rethinkers that are elementary school students working on policy. And so when we think about association to pro-social peers, connecting to a caring adult, it's not just about mentoring. It's also about letting young people be partners in defining the problem and what the solutions are and being active champions in that change. And Rethinkers is an example of that, where they've looked at restorative justice practices within their school. Also something that really goes to this, skills and solving problems nonviolently. So they have a wonderful 9-minute YouTube clip. If you ever need a bit of inspiration, go listen to those kids. We don't just do caring attachments for attachment's sake. We want to really create young people that can see themselves as part of partners in the problem and in the solution.
Great, thanks, Annie. This is individual level risk factors. Obviously, there are more X's here than on any of the other charts, unfortunately, and I think this is really just more of a function of academics and study design, and that it's a lot easier to study and to measure risk and protective factors at the individual level and just have folks complete a survey. The emphasis on the Connecting the Dots document, should you choose to download it after this webinar, is really on the community and neighborhood level things that we can do that are going to bring about population level change. But really what I want to emphasize here is the X's that cut across the different types of violence and go back to the point I made earlier about the importance of just measuring, low-hanging fruit, of measuring changes in other types of violence, even if your particular intervention just targets one type of violence. Again, for SB perpetration, lack of nonviolent problem skills, inability to come up with other more peaceful solutions to problems, poor impulse control and behavior, a history of direct violent victimization, as well as witnessing other types of violence in the community, and a history of involvement with substance use are all risk factors for sexual violence, but again, particularly substance use we see cuts across all the types of violence, and witnessing violence cuts across all the types of violence with the exception of elder abuse.
And Marcy, just to clarify a question, you're talking about risk factor. This report is talking about risk factors for perpetration, not about victimization.
Yes, David, I believe I said that at some point.
You did say that, but the question came up in the text chat again, so I want to make sure we're clear.
You multitask better than I. I've been amazed at how quickly you and Annie are able to do both things at the same time. Yes, these are all risk factors for perpetration of these different types of violence. We really, again, want to move away from the victim blaming, and we're trying to focus our efforts here at CDC on what we can do to prevent perpetration of all of these types of violence.
Right, and I think CDC says it a lot, that just because a risk is there, it doesn't mean that someone's going to perpetrate, and just because someone's been exposed to one form of violence doesn't mean they're going to become a perpetrator, and it's a really important distinction to make, that this is about risk and resilience and balancing the two things, and having a better understanding of what are the prevention strategies that are good solutions to multiple problems.
I just want to echo I did want to echo Nancy's point here that what is not a risk factor for SB perpetration is certainly also important too. And I think you'll see that what was not a risk factor that might be of interest at the individual level, for example, low education, not a risk factor for SB perpetration, and mental health problems, not a risk factor for SB perpetration.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we wanted to give you an idea about is some of the best practices and what folks are doing when, a lot of folks are doing curriculum that are looking at problem-solving skills and things like that. And one of the things they're doing in Portland at the Division of Public Health, and this is under the Defending Childhood Initiative, is they've actually come together to set standards for social-emotional learning. So understanding what are the, not only the best practices in science, but what makes the most sense for them locally. And it goes back to that great tool CDC has about understanding the evidence, that it's about context, it's about experience, and the best available research evidence. So for example, in this group, they said anything coming in about social emotional learning, we want to have something about diversity within it because we have so many new immigrants from, and I believe in their case it's East Africa, coming into our schools. We want to make sure that anything we do also has that piece of it. So I wanted to encourage you to think about that. The other thing is, and again, this is another Defending Childhood Initiative site in Grand Forks, is they are reaching every child in their school district. They're looking at risk and resilience factors, and they're accounting for age and context. So when we're thinking about, what are the good practices you're doing here, if you think about, how this prevents multiple forms of violence, you can think about how many other partners you can have and what the reach looks like with your social emotional learning. So we wanted to share these two examples with you.
So Marcy, why do you focus on shared risk and protective factors?
Let me tell you, David, why we focus on shared risk and protective factors. Because, as I said in the first slide with the arrows, we know that multiple forms of violence often occur simultaneously. And again, the whole drive for this document was to really reflect the reality that you practitioners and others are working with the same communities and families that are experiencing all of these forms or some of these forms of violence at the same time. This also gives folks an opportunity to develop new partnerships and hopefully leverage resources and funding streams that might be limited in one area with another area. And particularly in sexual violence prevention, where we know the evidence base is limited, consider a larger pool of strategies. I know my colleague Sarah DeGue here at CDC wrote an article about the overlap, for example, between youth violence and sexual violence risk factors, and suggested, for example, looking at youth violence prevention strategies related to sexual violence prevention as well.
Yeah. And I think as we move forward, I know Bridget had a question about additional information on the social emotional learning standards in Portland. They are finalizing that right now, Bridget, and if you send me a quick email, Annie@PreventInstitute.org, I'll connect you to Barrett over there, and they can get you the latest. Because of time, hey Marcy, I wanted to think maybe this section is the one that we let people go to on their own, skip to the multiple forms of violence result in common outcomes. What do you think about that? This next section
that sounds like an excellent idea.
Okay. So the next section we have is about exposure to one form of violence increases the risk for further victimization. It's kind of the less discussion-oriented section, and CDC has some incredible data there about very specifically how specific things are tied to other specific things. And in the report, they have that all detailed. In the slides, you have that all here. But I think for the purposes of timing today, we'll let you explore that topic a little bit on your own, and we're going to go to the next link between multiple forms, which is multiple forms of violence result in common outcomes. And specifically, we're looking at ACEs and trauma as two common outcomes that help us understand what kind of prevention solutions would prevent multiple forms of violence. Marcy, go ahead.
Thanks, Annie. And I'm just going to really skim over this. I think from the comments we've seen earlier, a lot of people are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was a survey of over 17,000 adults in the Kaiser Waiting Room in California. So these are not an exceptionally high-risk sample. These are folks who are gainfully employed and who have health insurance. And they assess their experiences retrospectively. So they ask them about what types of adverse childhood experiences they experienced, and adverse experiences included things like parental divorce, parental substance use or mental illness, parental incarceration, witnessing intimate partner violence, being the direct victim of any type of child maltreatment, physical, sexual, emotional. And they found, again, not of a huge high-risk population, that 42% of their sample had experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. And they found that those experiences in childhood had significant implications for their health as adults. And you can see here the way it influenced risky behavior, smoking, obesity, asthma, early teen pregnancy, and things like multiple partners, STD, miscarriage, etc. And I think we have one more ACE slide.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was me who didn't do it there.
Okay, I know this is a busy slide. We have a whole ACE infographic on our Veto Violence website that I would encourage you to go to. The point here is that the circles get bigger. So as folks experience an increasing number of adverse childhood experiences, they're more likely to experience negative physical and mental health outcomes. That big green circle, I believe, is suicide attempts. Increased risk of cancer, I think, is that aqua type of bubble there. Yellow, I think, is with heart disease. So again, as the number of ACEs go up, the greater the likelihood of experiencing all of these negative outcomes.
Okay, so let's now go ask a question for you. Back to the audience. We've been talking about these linkages, and some people have shared some of the ways they have. Now, having thought about this and having the attention, I'd like to get a sense of how do you expect to be using the information that we talked about today? And when you read the report, and notice, Marcy, I keep on doing the when it will happen. How do you expect to be using it? So I'd love to hear people. How do you plan on using this information in your prevention efforts? Because we have an audience here who are doing a lot of really great prevention work, and love to just get a sense of how do you expect to use this information in your prevention efforts. So we'd love to get that idea. This is helpful for us. This is one of the things that, Marcy, we've talked about that you really want to be following up on also, is to see how this has been used to help be able to improve people's practice and be able to strengthen prevention efforts.
Yes, and we are collecting all of this, so please send it to us. If not in the text box here, then email one of us and let us know.
So we've seen talking about building more partnership opportunities, supporting documentation for prevention efforts, looking at assessment tools, leveraging resources. I think that's going to be a really interesting one to hear about. I think Oregon is well represented on today's call from looking at who's writing in. But we'd love to hear from others of you about how you use this information for your prevention efforts. And we'll be able to go over, and so building connections, leveraging resources, and trying to be able to find ways to coordinate prevention efforts. That is a great way to be able to do things. And all the Oregon people are now being proud of how well they communicate. So thank you very much. Let's go talk about Annie.
Why don't you? So I'll take it from there. So one of the things we talked about is understanding that multiple forms of violence result in common outcomes. And some of those are those health outcomes that ACE highlights. Another piece is developmental assets. For those of you with a good child development background, this is the work of David Finkelhor, and he says, it doesn't matter what kind of violence it is. Across the developmental lifespan, all of these milestones are really interrupted. And if a caregiver is dealing with violence, it really gets in the way of their impact, of their ability to be a strong caregiver. So we wanted to kind of share that long list there because, again, it doesn't matter the type of violence. The impact is the same on development. And the second piece we wanted to highlight, in addition to health outcomes and developmental milestones, is thinking about trauma. And I know Kalila's here, who's doing a lot of work in Louisville on trauma and thinking about multiple forms of violence. One thing we always point out at Prevention Institute is this experiences or situations that are emotionally painful, but it's also dealing with chronic adversity, things like discrimination, racism, sexism, poverty. That is traumatic. And so as we ask people to consider things like PTSD, we always push them to say, it's not post in most of these cases, it's persistent. And one of the other things we've asked folks to consider lately is not thinking about it as a disorder, it's thinking about it as an injury and how much that changes who's deserving of support when we think about being exposed to violence is an injury that actually can be healed, it can be prevented, but it takes the stigma, I think, out of some of that concept of disorder. And we also, this is a public health model, so we're always asking people to think, not in terms of individuals only, but also in terms of community. And what does it look like to be in communities that have had generational experiences with community violence and sexual assault and domestic violence? And how does that impact systems, neighborhoods, schools, families? And as preventionists, what can we really do that acknowledges that impact? And one of the papers we have here with Professor Pinderhughes did a lot of work on this on preventing trauma at the community level. And it's things you're probably already doing: restorative justice, healing circles, reclaiming, improving public spaces, shifting community social norms. What's wonderful is now with this tool that we've developed with CDC, you have the science that backs up a lot of these things that are very popular in community for preventing multiple forms of violence that are popular in those trauma circles. You have an understanding and kind of a basis for how those connect. So let me turn it over to Marcy, because I think she has a couple more examples of some of those good strategies that prevent multiple forms of violence.
I do. We have one slide here. I'm really conscious of the time, and I know everybody is really waiting just to get to Tommy's slide. So I just want to say in the document we summarize these big categories of types of prevention strategies for folks to consider. Again, we wanted to leave enough leeway for you to implement what you think makes the most sense in your community. And again, when you download the document, you will be able to read about them there.
Yes. Yes. And so kind of in summary, and again, you guys are all experts. That's one of the fun things about getting on PreventConnect. These are some of the things that you've brought up before. We've adapted from a presentation, again, from David Finkelhor. But honoring these linkages between multiple forms of violence reduces the potential shortcomings in our work. Like for me, this is an integrity issue. This is an ethical work. Like I'm here to do my best to support communities and create organizations and practices that do the best they can to help. And to do that, I cannot underestimate the true scope of victimization. I cannot, buy into limitations in identifying children who are poly victims, the unnecessary competition for scarce resources, reduced policy influence, arbitrary distinctions, and most importantly, as we started today, kind of with Taylor's story, ignoring the perspective of child and community. Like these are the things I value, and so that's one of the reasons I'm willing to explore and change my work to think about an integrated approach. So in review, hopefully, we did this quickly, but we have actually, Prevention Institute has a longer brief that will be coming out in the next couple of months on this, in addition to the CDC brief we co-authored. But it's multiple forms of violence are experienced together. They share some of those common underlying factors, and they result in some of the common outcomes. Exposure, again, to one form of violence is often, the other piece of that, but there are all sorts of ways people are looking at that. And I just want to kind of end on this slide here. This is with Sesame Workshop. They did a lot of work at different forms of violence, and what they said it came down to is they want to counter sorrow and sadness with talk, time, and love. And as much as this work is complex and requires us to bust down silos and work with our funders and do all these other things, the simplicity of this is, good prevention solutions are talk, time, and love really struck me, and I hope for you it makes you feel how possible this is. But with that, I want to turn it over to Tommy and let David introduce her, because she's the one doing this work right now, and I think we have a lot to learn from her experience.
So I'm really pleased to be able to have Tomei Kuehl, and she's with from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So Tomei, we've been laying out a lot of pieces, but you're actually been working on how to be able to implement this. So I'm going to hand the podium over to you.
Great, thanks David, and thank you so much for the opportunity to kind of talk about the work that we're doing. We've been really excited about the Connecting the Dots document. We've shared it with our grantees, and it's been really exciting to hear them talk about it, how they can strategically leverage dollars within different funding sources, as well as work more collaboratively with other agencies. There's been a lot of really cool conversations. And I think the thing that has been most useful for us in terms of this document is that it has tethered us to a shared vision and connects our work that has often been discussed in silos. So it's also made it easier for us to think about shared evaluation, which is always something we bump into. So I wanted to provide some context for where the sexual violence prevention unit sits, which is the program that I manage. And I think this context is important because as you can see from the programs that are in our branch, there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration and overlap of risk and protective factors. And I also want to acknowledge one of the slides that we had to quickly go over was the Bold Steps document that was actually created about 8 years ago from our branch, and my current supervisor was the author of that document, but it outlines strategies for how to do this shared risk and protective factor approach. And so there's been a lot of work in our branch historically around this work, so I want to acknowledge that work and also say that what I'm going to talk about today is more of the modern present day examples that we've been thinking about this shared risk and protective factor approach. So this next slide really gets at sort of the other piece that was really critical for how we thought about this work. So in addition to being situated in a place that was conducive to thinking about this work, we also were really fortunate to have been a CDC empowerment pilot site. And as a result of that work, our empowerment evaluator actually created a shared risk and protective factor pilot table. So this is well before the Connecting the Dots document, but so some of the language may be a little bit different, but it was the place where we started. And we were really looking at the best available research at that time, and it identified risk and protective factors for perpetration, victimization, general violence, sexual violence, teen dating violence, intimate partner violence, and bullying, and it looked at it across the social ecological model. And this was critical in terms of how we began to think about risk and protective factors for the sexual violence prevention unit, and it was how we developed our strategic plan as well as our most recent RFA. So this key first step was the research. So I'm so thankful that the folks at CDC have come up with this document because it takes some of that work away from us. So the first phase of how we thought about this was to pilot a project with 3 unique grantees. One was focused on teen dating violence specifically, another was focused on intimate partner violence, and a third was really focused on LGBTQ specific issues related to sexual violence and domestic violence prevention and intervention. And so because we assumed those are very similar to sexual violence, and so could we pilot projects with them and see if they actually impacted the similar outcomes that we were looking for. And so, for example, some of the outcomes that we were looking at was attitudes and beliefs about gender norms, such as hypermasculinity, strict gender roles, et cetera. So basically what we did was we funded 3 agencies that were focused on those topics. And for us, the success has been basically that all 3 of them went through the last round of funding, the competitive process, and were selected to be funded for this newest round of funding because they demonstrated a really high capacity to do this work. And we're targeting those risk and protective factors that were important to SV overall. So because that worked, we thought, well, hey, can we expand this beyond sort of DV, IPV, TDV, and look at maybe some other programs that are working at this from more of a positive use development framework. And so one of the pieces that you didn't see in the initial introduction to where SVP sits is a program called Tony Gramps' Youth Services. They were with our branch for a while and actually have since moved to the Colorado Department of Human Services. But they have been an important partner with the SVP program. And so they have historically funded youth violence prevention programming, and there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do. And so this idea was really to partner with them to see if we could pilot a project with folks from their qualified list, folks that they didn't have money to fund, but who were working on risk and protective factors that we were interested in. And so we actually piloted with 2 grantees. One was focused on a mentoring program, and the other was an early childhood program. And so this was also a success, and in that actually it created more opportunities for us to expand who we brought to the table as partners as well as people that we funded. So it's created a lot of opportunities for relationship building for us. So as a result of that, because those were successes, we have framed our most recent RFA around these. And so we expanded our recruitment efforts, as I mentioned, and we broadened our outreach efforts and had, I think we had about 30 applicants for our funding. So what we basically did is, what you'll see here is a list of prioritized risk factors for perpetration of sexual violence. And what we asked grantees or applicants to do was to select a risk and a protective factor at each level of the social ecological model that they were going to try to impact. And the unique thing about this list is that we only selected risk and protective factors that impacted multiple types of violence on this list. So inherent to our RFA process was a shared risk and protective factor framework. And by developing theories of change for the prioritized risk and protective factors, applicants were also using a shared risk and protective factor framework because the risk and protective factors that they could select had already been determined to address multiple forms of violence. So this for us was a really easy way to infuse our funding stream with a shared risk and protective factor approach. So grantees didn't have to think about how am I doing all these pieces, but we just made it inherent to sort of the process. And here's a list of the protective factors, so you can get a sense of that. We had 9 applicants were selected by a funding committee through a competitive process, and because each level, we also prioritize the community voice in our funding, so each individual grantee has a very different strategy, which can make it really difficult when you're thinking about how to evaluate your work. But the other great part about shared risk and protective factors is that it tethers, regardless of the strategy, it tethers you to sort of a core principle. And so we contracted with CSU, and they helped us develop a tool based on those shared risk and protective factors that the selected agencies were working to impact. And so we have currently developed a tool. The 2 protective factors that we are currently measuring are life and interpersonal skills and information knowledge and skills for healthy sexuality. And the risk factors that we are evaluating are antisocial, delinquent, and violent behavior, and then attitudes and beliefs about gender roles. And so at the end of these 3 years, we hope that this tool will show us strategies that have given us the most success in a variety of communities across Colorado, and it will help inform future strategic planning, and it really gives us a way to compare apples and oranges. So this next part is still something that we're thinking about, and we are working with CDC to get approval to potentially do this, but this is kind of our newest iteration of how to potentially do this work. And it's a collaborative effort within our department between child fatality prevention, youth violence prevention, the Tony Gramsci's Youth Services Program, the Sexual Violence Prevention Program, and the Suicide Prevention Program. And what we're looking to do is pilot a project in 7 schools to implement an evidence-based suicide prevention curriculum called Sources of Strength. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but the shared protective factor protective factors that we are looking at based on that strategy are school connectedness, and we posit youth-adult connectedness. We're going to be testing, hopefully filling in that box perhaps with some research around youth-adult connectedness for sexual violence. But the plan or the idea is, pending CDC approval, is to implement the NREP program of Sources of Strength and use our SVP-specific evaluation tool to see if we're impacting risk and protective factors prioritized by the SVP program. So it's kind of a new, unique way to kind of think about how our work has a broader impact beyond just the specific teen dating violence, sexual violence programs that exist. So for us, success has really been looking at how we've expanded who we fund, who we have relationships and partnerships with. And though most of my conversation today was focused on how we made funding decisions, this document, this Connecting the Dots document, has actually created lots of collaborative relationships that we didn't have in place before, because it's given us a shared language and a shared vision for where we want to go in Colorado. So even though we don't have enough money to fund everybody that we would hope to be able to fund, we have so many great relationships with folks from local crisis centers and the state coalition to youth development programs, teen dating violence folks, universities, et cetera. It's been really just a great tool for us to leverage those partnerships. So I wanted to talk a little bit about marijuana, because I'm sure most of you know that we've passed a law that has made it legal to have recreational marijuana, and this actually fits into our story about shared risk and protective factors. So as I've mentioned before, we have a partner agency at the Colorado Department of Health and Human Services, Tony Gramsci's Youth Services Program. And so they recently, we saw a large influx of marijuana dollars to the state, and the legislature actually awarded an additional $2 million from marijuana tax dollars to the TGYS program because they are a respected youth violence prevention program. And so TGYS had already released an RFA and had made funding decisions. They did have a qualified list because they were only able to originally fund 42 people through their original appropriation. And they currently fund programs that are focused on things like restorative justice, mentoring, after-school programming, as well as early childhood education. And because the legislature required that the additional $2 million be used to target youth marijuana prevention, the TGYS board decided to use the program's existing infrastructure and shared risk and protective factor approach to distribute the funds. And I'll say as a side note that one of the benefits of doing this is that they didn't have to recreate a brand new RFA. So for those of you that do that at your state agencies, you know how much work it is to get an RFA through. So this is a strategic way to kind of get around that and meet the needs of what the legislature wanted. And so basically what happened was They focused on the risk factor of substance abuse because it was very similar to what, alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs work that was already being done in those fields. And then the protective factor that they focused on was school connectedness and perceived harm. So they reached out to the qualified list of grantees, folks that essentially there just wasn't enough money to give to in the initial round of funding, and asked them if they could clarify in their application how their original strategy would impact marijuana and provide research and literature supporting their theory. So with that additional $2 million, they were actually able to fund 24 additional agencies. And one of the cool things is that they're actually evaluating. There are specific marijuana questions that the legislature is requiring of the 24 agencies that are getting those dollars, but they're actually going to be evaluating all 64 grantees based on those marijuana questions, so we can get a better understanding of how different strategies impact that outcome that they're looking at. So that's just another kind of example of how funding can be used to leverage a shared risk and protective factor approach. And then one of the last things, here's my contact information, and I'm happy to share any materials or answer any questions or just even hear ideas that you guys have around this, because I know there's a lot of really cool work happening across the country. But I also wanted to just put a plug in for my colleague Tyler Osterhaus. He's been amazing. We've developed a webinar series ourselves here, and it's really focused within our branch on shared risk and protective factors. And so how do we begin talking about this work as professionals within our branch? And so we've had some really exciting momentum around that, and it's cool to see how all this work is unfolding.
Thank you, Tomei. Just talking about the developments with the legalization of marijuana for recreational use and how to be able to do the work, it's very exciting to be able to see. I'd like to now, and Annie, I think there's a question you were posing, is let's hear a little bit from our audience about how I think this is a different time and people are starting to make more about connections. So we'd love to hear from you all about why now? Why do you think this is the time for us to be able to do this? What's happening right now in our field that helps us make these shifts so we can think about connecting the dots?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we asked this question was going back to the literature and seeing how many years academics had made the case for this as a more effective practice, but knowing that it wasn't happening too much in practice. So we'd love to hear from you, how would you make the case to policymakers or the executive director? Tomei, you did a great job about, why this makes sense at the state level, and, how would you make the case for folks that were skeptical? What do you think is, what's compelling about this where we can really change things now in a way that we haven't before?
And you're asking me that question?
Oh, no, that was for everyone. That's the text.
Okay.
So Virginia, you can chime in while other folks are typing in. What would you say, Tomei? And then we'll get to Virginia and some of the other comments in the text chat.
I think for us it's really dependent on who your audience is. I mean, for the first piece for us is really just getting everyone connected around this idea of who's doing the work or making a funding decision, and then it really, how do you link it to the outcomes that you want to see? Because that's like for the legislature, for example, that's really what they care about. So just framing it in a way that makes sense to whomever your audience is.
Yeah. And I saw Virginia put in that, resources are so stretched right now that partnership is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And this is a real interesting way to think about partnership. Vinny also kind of puts the same thing about, folks are pressed to collaborate so much more, to think about it as a non-duplication of services, but also as a link to chronic disease, infectious disease. Did you want to chime in, David? Did I hear you?
So, no, I was actually trying to find the slide. Your slides are up on the website, Tomei. Someone was asking about them, and I'm going to put the link to where they can get your slides. So we can be able to, I think that this is just a really, as we see here, there's a lot of people, the point that I was going to really make, we have limited time, we have limited resources, and we have to be able to figure out how we can do these together, and that when we honor when we live in the silos, then things aren't going to get to, but we need to be able to, people live real full lives, and that's where I think we need to be focusing on. This is why now.
David, we can't hear you now. I think your headset might have come
more efficient
out.
and a way to actually affect the way people live.
David?
David? He clearly can't hear us either.
Okay, you can put something in the text chat.
My voice, my headphone died on me, so I am now moved to my headset.
Oh, there we go.
I apologize for that. So we only have about a few minutes left, and I know several people are writing in, and that's much better. That's why you couldn't hear me, because my headset had just faded, but I was still talking. So I know you've thought about this, Annie, about some of the reasons that you think is now. So what are some of the things that you think about?
Well, these might look familiar for some folks like Benny, who were on kind of an initial discussion we had over the summer. But when we talked to some of the folks at the state level, they said, when thinking about why now, these were three things that they came up as. One is the financial environment. It's a great way to do some leveraging. They also said, people are big on collective impact and community collaboration, and this is a tool to really help make that happen. The other thing was how well it links nicely into ACEs and also kind of trauma, or some of the things that we talked to too, is that it gives you an idea of, okay, well, what do we do? Like, we know these things are linked, we know we have a role to play, but here's some very concrete ways that we can work together. I saw some of the comments in the text chat as well. We're thinking about, where did it go? It just went up. Hold on one second, I want to pull it up. When Molly McLeay was talking about college campuses, that the legislation is asking folks to look not only at sexual violence, but also domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, and about that intersectionality. And what I like is, not only does it say, hey, we have good solutions that solve multiple problems, we have great science that backs it up. And I think having those two things together are a really powerful place where you can come to a policymaker or to a funder and say, look, we've got a good solution. Let's try to pilot this and let's see what this looks like on the ground. And I feel like that's where folks are at right now. The Defending Childhood Initiative doesn't make folks choose one form of violence. They're able to choose multiple ones. And so thinking about their evaluation results and kind of what's going to come out of that in the next couple of years at the federal level, hopefully will be a real interesting way to think about going beyond silos.
And then I do love the comment that Tyler puts in about, appreciating starting with Taylor and poetry. And we need our science, and we need our programs, and we also need our passion, and to be able to capture the passion of work. And they need that engagement and to find ways of engagement. And I think that what we were trying to do today, and I think in the work, is how do we find that engagement? How do we use our science? How do we use our knowledge? How do we use that to develop programs to make community impact?
Yeah. Patrick brings up a comment that Benny went back to about, there's a pressure to talk about bullying, for example, and not about sex, and that's a potentially serious challenge. And, it's an interesting question. I think people have differing opinions on it. And one of the things we hear from folks is that, starting with some of these shared factors, they don't have to lead with things that are as contentious. And then we have longtime folks in the field that stand up and say, look, if we're not talking about power and control, if we're just talking about neighborhood cohesion, we're not going to be preventing domestic violence. And I think that's a really interesting place to sit in as a preventionist and think about how you're doing both of those things and honoring kind of some of those other pieces at the core of our work too.
I do not know what Tyler's webinar on Confessions of Monsters was, but Benny was very appreciative. So fill in more, Benny, about what that does. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to just be able to really get a chance to be able to let people know where to get more information. As we've been talking about this report, and it's connecting the dots, and it's available both on CDC's and Prevention Institute's websites. We do have the contact information for Natalie and Marcy. Natalie is her colleague who you saw the picture there, who is sitting right next to her, and then also their colleague Joanne worked on the team, and these are contact information. And Tomei, once again, we have her contact information. And also so thank you all, Natalie and Marcy from CDC. Thank you, Tomei, from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And I want to really thank Annie Lyles from Prevention Institute, who does a lot of work, there, and has worked with us very closely at Prevention Institute. In the last 8 years, I've had the chance to work with Annie, and Ashley actually has worked with Annie even prior to that. And so I also want to thank all of you behind. we will be doing at the conclusion of this web conference when we're sending an evaluation. One of the things we're going to ask is what you're going to do, what you would plan to do with this presentation. You have an option to put down your name and say that because we are looking to do a follow-up with you if you give us permission to do so, and we will follow up with you and find out what stuff you actually have done. We're sort of thinking about this like you're filling out a postcard of an intent, and then we're going to follow up and try to learn what we can do to help inform that, and we'll report back as PreventConnect to you about some of the ways that people have been making changes in their communities. So I'm really excited about that effort. So thank you all available. This is going to be recorded. We do have another one, though it has sold out, but people should join the wait list. We might be able to get a few more spaces onto that wait list. And any last words do any of our guests want to have?
Oh, this is Annie. Thanks everyone for joining in the discussion, and I hope you'll keep in touch. We're doing some more work on this at Prevention Institute. Co-authoring with CDC was the first step, and I know CDC wants to do more too, so I hope you'll all keep in touch.
Yes, this is Marcy and Natalie. We echo that, and thank you very much for having us, and we look forward to hearing about all the great things you're doing.
Okay, and Tomei, any last word? Probably on mute. So thank you all. I'd like to really appreciate it and joining us on PreventConnect, and hope to see you again on future PreventConnect web conferences. We'll be working on our next year, 2016's web conferences, so we have for our 10th year of PreventConnect. So thank you very much. This concludes today's web conference. I'll keep the text chat open for a few minutes. In about a half hour, you will receive our evaluation form. Thank you very much, and it was thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Calcasa. Great conversation.